subject this morning is the topic of morality, culture, and the economy. And my purpose in speaking to you is to provide you with some insights from my own academic work into the complex, complicated, and often challenging subject of the relationship between morality, culture, and economic life. And I hope that my thoughts will be helpful in helping you to consider some questions that touch upon international relations, especially when it comes to some of the political and economic challenges facing not only the European Union, but also the United States today. And many of the thoughts I'm going to express this morning, you can find more detailed treatment of in my recently released book entitled Becoming Europe, where there is an extended treatment of some of these themes. So let's begin by going back to 2008. Now, as anyone who lived through the financial crisis that rocked Wall Street as well as the European Union with increasing intensity throughout 2008, as anyone who lived through that will know, the sense of systematic failure that was pervading American society at the time was visibly palpable. You could feel it. The self-doubt of many Americans in their economic system was personified by the former Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan, who confessed during his congressional testimony that his faith in free markets had been shaken. "I found a flaw," Greenspan stated. "I don't know how significant or permanent it is, but I have been very distressed by that fact." Now, the idea that there was something fundamentally wrong with American capitalism at the time was a view that was shared and loudly expressed by many prominent Europeans in the last 4 months of 2008. In a widely publicized speech, Germany's then finance minister, Peter Steinbrück, criticized the American economic system. The financial crisis, he insisted, is above all an American problem. He continued, "America is the origin and clear focal point of the crisis, but it is now spreading worldwide like a poisonous oil spill." Now, similar statements echoed across Europe's political spectrum. Their common theme was summed up in a few short sentences by France's then president, Nicolas Sarkozy. Self-regulation, Sarkozy claimed, as a way of solving all problems is finished. Laissez-faire is finished. The all-powerful market that always knows best is finished. Now, whether the American economy of 2008 was as unregulated, laissez-faire, or finished as some Americans and Europeans imagined at the time, I think is very questionable. But what is clear is that just 1 year after Wall Street's meltdown, many member states of the EU were well into their own phase of pronounced economic instability, and some of them are still in that phase. At the beginning of 2010, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain found themselves staring into an economic abyss as they desperately tried to fight off the humiliation of sovereign debt default. Such were the debt levels of these countries, which acquired the unfortunate acronym of PIGS, that in May 2010, the EU effectively abandoned its previous no bailout stand so that it could join the International Monetary Fund in creating a massive safety net for the pigs. Images of rioters burning tires, looting shops, and attacking police in the streets of Athens in protest against austerity measures introduced by Greece's government, symbolized many Europeans' shock and anger at what was happening. Now, the contrast between American and European reactions to their respective crises as they played out over 2009 and 2010 could not have been more different. After the initial panic subsided, many Americans found themselves growing gradually uneasy and increasingly enraged at the suddenness and size of the federal government's growth in response to the economic downturn. The equally dramatic rise of what's called the Tea Party movement as a force in American politics during this period cannot be understood without this background. Now, to a good number of Americans, the bailout of banks, Congress's apparently insatiable appetite for spending, the passing of Obamacare into law, the new regulations for the financial industry, and the government's rescue of American car companies increasingly looked like a wider pattern. Something seemed to be changing, and not necessarily for the better, in American economic and political life. Now, herein lies what I think is a crucial element that increasingly matters for international relations and international political economy. That many of the challenges facing economies today are driven by moral and cultural factors that more and more social scientists and economists are addressing. Now, culture is one of those phenomena to which we all refer, but often with little precision about what we mean. On one level, culture is often used to describe the importance of symbols, rituals, and collective memory. At the root of culture, however, are human beings. Unlike plants and animals, humans can consciously cultivate ideas, things, and the natural world through their choices and actions. Hence, in its broadest sense, culture encapsulates everything that humans develop through their minds and work. Now, over time, these choices and habits may become concretized in various products, protocols, and even institutions that themselves shape our choices, sometimes without us being particularly conscious of these influences. Any one culture, therefore, embraces more than simply the material things and technology created by people. It also includes recognizable ways of living and acting that emerge from a distinguishable set of attitudes, customs, conventions, laws, ways of working, methods of communication, learned and learnable patterns of behavior, and practices of religion. Taken together, these features of life constitute a more or less lasting and recognizable cultural reality. But at the heart of all these distinctive historical and social features, we find social and political and economic formations that are central to a country or a continent's identity. What we find at their center are the intentions, the principles, the ideas, and the beliefs to which a given society gives high value. Now, cultures are complex. They're usually untidy, they're usually in a state of flux, and they do not lend themselves easily to certain types of scholarly analysis. That may be one reason why so much of mainstream economics, which has been dominated by mathematically centered forms of analysis since the 1940s, often treats culture as a somewhat mysterious subject and therefore tends to ignore it. empirical analysis to the study of economic life has its uses. But it can also tempt people to believe that those things that cannot be measured, or those things that cannot be quantified, somehow don't exist, or somehow are of marginal relevance. The fact, however, that culture is sometimes difficult to quantify does not mean it is not real, or that it does not have significant and immense implications for economic life. Now, a good example of this is the different views taken by Americans and Europeans to a subject like healthcare. Whatever people might think of the Obama administration's 2010 healthcare legislation, it is difficult to deny that many Americans' profound opposition to Obamacare, even today, the majority of Americans are deeply opposed to Obamacare, that this opposition was based on more than just a cold cost-benefit analysis. No doubt many Americans were and are concerned about the economic inefficiencies associated with any government monopoly. But many Americans also believed that Obamacare would unreasonably restrict people's economic choices, incentivize them to take less responsibility for their lives, facilitate the further bureaucratization of healthcare, and expand the government's control of the American economy. What's important here is that a strong value component was central to all these concerns. No one who attended any of the anti-Obamacare rallies or the town hall meetings debating the subject could doubt that the opposition of Americans was based on more than just economics. It was at least partially derived from many Americans' sense that Obamacare simply did not accord with American expectations about the values, practices, and institutions that should underline and inform American economic life. Now, empirical research has its limitations in what it can teach us about reality. But in his 2010 book, The Battle, the social scientist Arthur Brooks drew upon a significant amount of data to demonstrate the consistent attachment of large majorities of Americans to a morally positive view of free enterprise, entrepreneurship, free markets, low tax rates, and a preference for a limited economic role for government. In this light, the intensity and persistence, the continuing persistence of many Americans' hostility to Obamacare should not surprise us. Brooks went on, however, to point out the same data indicated that high-income, high-education individuals working in what he calls the intellectual industries, such as the universities, the law, and the media, had far less favorable views of the values, principles, and institutions associated with free markets. He also observed that on average, Americans below the age of 40 tended to be less suspicious of government intervention. Now, Brooks's research receives some confirmation from research conducted into the attitudes of the Occupy Wall Street movement. This indicates that the embrace by young occupiers, defined as being in their 20s, of slogans such as freedom and responsibility and their attacks on crony capitalism were, quote, solely surface level and hollow, end quote. Beneath the rhetoric, the Occupy Wall Street crowd turned out to be overwhelmingly concerned with issues of economic security and safety. They were quite hostile to free markets, and they were very susceptible to any movement or leader that offers to decrease the uncertainty and level of risk in contemporary society. Now, if these analyses of the data are correct, then numerically speaking, Americans who have a morally favourable view of free enterprise and free markets remain a majority. But numbers are not everything. No one, for example, should doubt the disproportionate cultural influence of what Arthur Brooks calls the 30% coalition upon American life. Now, in this context, it is very revealing that the depth of many Americans' opposition to Obamacare was a source of puzzlement to the 30% coalition. But equally revealing is the fact that many Europeans at the time, including many conservative Europeans, simply could not understand why anyone would morally or economically oppose the state's assumption of such a central part in the provision of healthcare. However one views the economic arguments for and against the state provision of healthcare, many Europeans regarded the state's heavy involvement in healthcare delivery as the most effective and, more importantly, the most just way of institutionalizing people's responsibilities to those in need. What might be called the moral value of solidarity. Now, in much of Western Europe in particular, this language of solidarity and social justice permeates public discourse to an extent that often surprises Americans. It is also widely assumed by many Western Europeans that this moral responsibility should be primarily realized through state action. This is partly what Western Europeans have in mind when they refer to social Europe or to the European social model. Even minor efforts to reform social welfare programs, let alone reduce the welfare state size, are consequently regarded by many Western Europeans as a heartless assault on the weak and the marginalized, and a betrayal of the commitments widely associated with social Europe. Now, by contrast, America has given a somewhat different institutional expression to the idea that we should help our neighbor in need. America certainly does have a large, and now a growing, welfare state. But it also has a long history and contemporary practice of private associations addressing social and economic problems. Americans are often regarded as more individualistic than Western Europeans. This is one of the distinguishing features of America that struck the French social philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville when he visited the United States between 1831 and 1832. In this connection, Tocqueville marveled at the relative absence of government from American life. Tocqueville quickly realized, however, that this individualism and this small size of the state was not symptomatic of a callous disregard by Americans of their fellow citizens. Though Americans, Tocqueville observed, tended to dress up their assistance to others in the language of enlightened self-interest, Tocqueville underscored how Americans usually expressed the value of helping those in need through the habits and institutions of free and voluntary association. Some of these associations, like churches for example, had a more or less permanent presence in American society. Others lasted only as long as a particular economic or social problem persisted. As a consequence, the same pressures for centralized, top-down, government-led solutions that prevailed in Tocqueville's native France were simply not present in the young American Republic. So the moral of the story is, the lesson of the story is that economic culture matters. At the most basic level, it matters whether the people living in a given society prefer, for example, liberty to security, or if they prioritize equality of outcome over access to opportunity. It also matters how we give institutional expression to particular universal values, such as concern for those in need, in economic life. Depending on the nature of these values and institutions, they can either facilitate wealth creation and growing prosperity, or they can become what some call invisible liabilities that impede and undermine economic innovation, adaptation, and efficiency. Now, over the past 20 years, the economist who has presented perhaps the most penetrating case for the importance of economic culture for understanding the differences in ways that economies flourish or don't flourish is the 1993 Nobel Prize winner Douglas North. Douglas North is widely associated with the emergence of what is called new institutional economics. This is concerned with the study of how the nature of institutions, how they develop, and their effects upon the economy over long periods of time. Now, Douglas North himself acknowledges that he has since moved far beyond the boundaries of mainstream economics. Economics, North argues, cannot be separated from disciplines such as sociology and political science because, in his words, all the interesting issues are on the boundaries between them. In the real world, North says, moral, political, and economic questions are all mixed up. While some degree of separation can be useful for analytical purposes, at some point all these things need to be brought together. For North, it all comes together in the idea of institutions. As he stated in his 1993 Nobel Prize lecture, quote, "Institutions are the humanly devised constraints that structure human interaction. They are made up of formal constraints, rules, laws, constitutions, informal constraints, norms of behavior, conventions, and self-imposed codes of conduct, and their enforcement characteristics. Together, they define the incentive structure of societies and specifically economies." Now, observe how North weaves together what most of us think of as institutions, such as rules, laws, and constitutions, with values, norms of behavior, conventions, so self-imposed codes of conduct, as well as the means by which they are upheld and protected, the enforcement characteristics. Now, although North uses the phrase institutions to describe these things, this amounts, I think, to as good a summary of the idea of economic culture as you are likely to find. Now, I also think that the last part of the citation from North is very important, because it explains how a society's given economic culture influences people's choices. Any one economic culture will provide incentives for people to act in particular ways. Now, we often think of incentives primarily in financial terms, in terms of financial rewards. But incentives can also be non-financial. The desire to do good and to be seen as a good person can sometimes incentivize people to act in one way rather than another, even if, objectively speaking, it's the wrong moral choice. Incentives can also assume a coercive character, People may choose to act in particular ways because they fear that failure to act in such a manner will result in the application of arbitrary force, legal punishment, or even more commonly, stigmatization. What does this mean for economic culture? What it means is that if a given economic culture locates financial rewards in, for instance, proximity to political power, we should not be surprised to find that many businesses will focus their efforts upon getting as close as possible to government officials, politicians, as well as regulators. Likewise, if being seen as a good person by your peers is intrinsically associated with supporting a big welfare state, then some people will vote for big welfare states, despite the fact that economically speaking, it may not be in their best interests. Likewise, if the path to social ostracism lies in arguing that people should be helped to take care of themselves, then the incentives to be a prominent advocate of limiting government power are much lower. So, if this is all true, if everything I'm suggesting to you this morning is true, then economic culture has immense implications for how we understand economic development and the possibility of change. Certainly, changing policies, the rules of the game, is vitally important if we are going to alter a society's incentive structures. There's every difference in the world between the rules that govern economic life in, for example, a command economy, compared, for instance, to a relatively market-orientated economy. But, as Douglas North cautions, quote, both institutions and belief systems must change, since it is the mental models of the actors that will shape choices. Such are North's convictions on this matter, that he even argues that informal constraints that are favourable to growth can sometimes produce economic growth, even with unstable or adverse political rules. Now, these mental models that I'm talking about, they don't need to be explicit in people's minds. Much of the content of a given economic culture can consist in what the philosopher Karl Polanyi called tacit knowledge. Language is a good example of tacit knowledge. Up to a point, language can be formally taught and formally learnt. It cannot, however, be fully understood by reading a book of grammar or reading a dictionary. The more intangible aspects of language, such as knowing when to use particular tones, or when words are appropriately used in different contexts, these things are communicated tacitly, through personal experimentation, through watching others, through breathing in the context of a given language. This knowledge is thus internalized in people's behavior and choices through habit and practice, up to the point whereby most people act out these things unconsciously. They don't even know that they're doing it. So it is with much economic culture. The informal, unstated ways in which people interact in the economic setting of, for instance, a southern European country compared to an economy with distinctly Anglo-American features, such as Australia, may be very difficult for Italians and Australians to describe to each other, precisely because they are so ingrained in their daily economic life. Now, economic culture does not explain everything. American and European economic successes and failures are attributable to more than just institutions and values, as Douglas North understands them. Plenty of authors have illustrated the importance of factors such as war, peace, technological change, politics, and religion when seeking to understand why one economy differs from another. So my explanation is not, my effort today is not to provide you with an all-encompassing explanation of why different economies across the world are different. But I do think that if we neglect the idea of economic culture, then we neglect it at the peril of failing to understand why some economies develop and why others do not. Because whether the knowledge is explicit or tacit, the importance of the attitudes and the moral values that are at the core of North's mental models, I don't think they can be underestimated when it comes to understanding any economic culture. This claim is at the heart of arguments made by another Nobel Prize economist, Edmund Phelps, who has devoted considerable time in seeking to explain some of the differences in economic performance between America on the one hand and continental Western Europe on the other. Now, like many other people, Phelps concluded a long time ago that contemporary continental Western European economies are much less productive than America because of the prevalence of factors in Europe that discourage productivity, such as heavy labour market regulation, and weaknesses in those factors that encourage economic growth, such as vibrant capital markets. But, Phelps thought, this could not explain everything. Modern European nations, to use his phrase, were not a bunch of banana republics. Nor was it clear, Phelps claimed, that they were somehow lagging behind America when it came to classic predictors of growth, such as rule of law and property rights protections. Phelps's intuition was that the differences came down to America's economy being closer to one in which a private ownership system was structured for cutting-edge innovation. It was fertile in coming up with innovative ideas with prospects of profitability. It was shrewd and adept in selecting among those ideas for development. And finally, it was venturesome and willing to evaluate and try out new products and new methods. This in turn, Phelps went on to say, was influenced by a culture, a moral culture, that valued entrepreneurs, in which financiers were more willing to give different ideas a genuine evaluation and then risk backing them with capital, and where neither entrepreneurs nor financiers needed the tacit approval of social groups, politicians, or established businesses to try out their new products and services. By contrast, Phelps maintained, continental Western European economies were closer to a model in which private property arrangements were supplemented and sometimes suffocated by strong emphasis upon security and protection, the protection of established social groups, communities and regions, existing businesses, trade unions and professions. The emphasis was upon protecting all these things from the creative destruction of free markets. Now, this Western European focus upon security and stability provided enormous scope for new entrepreneurs to be blocked if they failed to gain the consent of existing stakeholders, such as employees, customers, and even rival companies. This was further underpinned by the priority accorded by many Western Europeans to a concern for social cohesion over individual engagement and personal growth. Now, drilling down into a range of data that surveyed the attitudes and values of Americans and citizens of major European countries towards variables such as change, such as acceptance of new ideas, such as views of competition and views of the desirability of freedom to make decisions, Phelps found that with minor exceptions, Americans had far more favourable views of such things than most Europeans. Hence, I came away, Phelps comments, with the impression that differences across countries with respect to certain well-defined institutions were not as important as the prevailing differences in morality and culture. As Phelps put it in his 2006 Nobel Prize lecture, various attributes of a country's economic culture serve to animate entrepreneurs and more broadly to encourage them by offering them a willing workplace and a receptive marketplace for their innovations. End quote. Now, Phelps even speculates that an economic culture can become so entrenched in a society over a long period of time that the minds of the people who live in such a society simply become closed to any other possibility. It may be, Phelps argues, that the French, having long since despaired of having more freedom and more initiative, have learned not to care very much about those values. Similarly, it may be that Americans, having assimilated large doses of freedom and initiative for generations, simply take initiative and freedom for granted. Now, in case you're thinking that I'm just articulating the ideas of myself and some American economists on this subject, let me point out to you that even some key European Union institutions, such as the Brussels-based European Commission, have become increasingly conscious of the significance of economic culture in explaining some important differences between Europe and America. In 2003, for instance, the European Commission published a green paper entitled Entrepreneurship in Europe. This green paper focused on two questions. Why did relatively few Europeans set up their own businesses? And second, why were so few European businesses growing? As it studied these two subjects over the following 5 years, the European Commission increasingly focused upon different attitudes towards entrepreneurship as a key explanatory factor. In a survey, a 2010 survey into views of entrepreneurship in Europe, America, and China, entitled Entrepreneurship in the EU and Beyond, the Commission found the following, quote, EU citizens appear to be almost evenly divided in their preference for being self-employed or for having employment status. By contrast, in the United States, a majority of respondents would opt for self-employment, while just over a third would prefer to be an employee. Similar results were seen in Iceland, Turkey, and South Korea. Interestingly, however, respondents in China said that they were it was most likely that they would prefer to be self-employed rather than an employee. In other words, a slight majority of Europeans preferred to work for someone else. They preferred to be an employee. And it's worth noting that these results were gathered in 2009. In other words, in the midst of a global economic downturn that would surely motivate even many entrepreneurially minded people to opt for security and stability. And yet, despite all this turmoil, Americans, and maybe more importantly, Chinese remain far more optimistic about entrepreneurship than most Europeans. Now, empirical data and attitudinal surveys are important, especially when it comes to satisfying social scientists and economists who have difficulty understanding the world without the assistance of mathematics and numbers. But these results, I think, were also compatible with the observations of historians very familiar with the life and history of both America and Europe. In his 2007 study of similarities and differences between Americans and Europeans, for example, the historian Dennis Bach drew upon comparative history, his own experience of living, working in, and writing about both continents, and the insights of European and American intellectuals, politicians, journalists, and CEOs. Bringing together this variety of sources, Bach concluded that an essential economic and political difference is that Europe was constructed from the top down, whereas America was made from the bottom up. Now, other factors, Bach acknowledges, have obviously made an impact. But his conclusion is very compatible with the evidence that was gathered by people like Douglas North and Edmund Phelps. In societies where less moral value is attached to the freedom to make decisions for yourself, it is hardly surprising that an emphasis upon top-down coordination by the state tends to prevail. In other words, it comes back to beliefs, it comes back to expectations, it comes back to attitudes, and it comes back to values. So, to conclude, what might all this mean for the conduct of international relations and international political economy? Let me make 3 concrete suggestions. First, the idea of economic culture. Understanding the place that moral values and moral preferences play in the development of any economic culture. I think it suggests that the development and trajectory of economic policy and economic life, whether in Europe or America, the study of these things needs to go beyond those models of development that do not take values and culture especially seriously. When it comes to such matters, many social scientists, especially some economists, are reluctant to consider these questions in detail because it is very difficult to measure the influence of such factors. But that in itself, I think, points to the limits and the limitations of empirical methods and empirical analysis. And as I said before, the fact that something is not measurable or is difficult to measure does not mean it doesn't exist or that it is somehow unimportant. My second suggestion is that the study of the same subject means we need to take economic history seriously and note how different moral value commitments can over time become embedded in economic practices and institutions. Again, this is not an exact science, and this does not mean that economic cultures are somehow unchangeable. But in trying to understand something like why a country such as France has, for instance, very different attitudes towards things like free trade, or very different attitudes about central banking compared to, for instance, Germany, I would suggest that some familiarity with the economic history of these different countries is surely useful, not least because I suspect you will find that very different value commitments underlie these different policy positions. Third, and lastly, serious attention to economic culture helps us to sense both the limitations under which various political actors pursue different economic agendas, but also more positively, their opportunities to engage in meaningful economic reform. In short, successful economic reform is not just about, and cannot be just about, changing institutions and the rules of the game. Political leadership must also focus upon identifying and transforming the values and the culture that underpin those very same institutions. Because in the end, it's not economics that drives history, as Karl Marx and others tried to persuade us to believe. Culture is, I think, what can create severe economic paralysis in a nation, if not entire continents. But cultural change can also facilitate economic development, wealth creation and prosperity in ways that many social scientists and economists have only just begun to understand. Thank you.